When the sudden flood disaster struck, Nurse Sandra Jones would make a decision that night that no one expected. Would she survive? 33-year-old Sandra Jones walked through the hospital corridors in the early morning light, and no one could know the secrets of her past. Her blue nurse uniform had replaced the military camouflage she had worn for years, but that determined look in her eyes, that would never change. But the phone call Sandra received that morning would change everything. Sandra's story actually began 3 years ago on the barren lands of Afghanistan. Back then, Health Sergeant Sandra Jones was stationed at Kandahar base. Her hands never trembled, her heart was steel, and she was the most trusted medical personnel of her commander, Major Rodriguez. Rescuing wounded soldiers in bomb explosions, rocket attacks, in the midst of all kinds of chaos, that was her job. But that last day that changed Sandra's life forever was different from everything else. While on patrol duty with her friend Mike, a roadside bomb exploded, severely injuring Mike. Sandra risked her own life trying to save him, but it was too late. Mike died in Sandra's arms. She didn't know yet. The biggest test of her life was coming that day. After returning from Afghanistan, Sandra struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder. She couldn't sleep at night and stayed constantly alert during the day. Psychologists at the military hospital suggested she transition to civilian life, so Sandra decided to move to San Francisco. When she started her job at San Francisco General Hospital, she was only 30 years old. She wanted to work in the emergency department because it reminded her of the field hospitals in Afghanistan. At least here she was still saving lives and felt she had found her purpose. The hospital where Sandra worked was one of the city's largest emergency centers. About 200 patients came daily, and Sandra usually dealt with the most critical cases. Her colleagues called her Ice Queen because she maintained her composure even in the most stressful moments. Of course, they didn't know that the source of Sandra's composure was her military training. But that day would be different. But the most shocking thing was that she would be left alone in the hospital during the flood disaster. That Tuesday morning shift hadn't started differently than usual. Sandra arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m. as always, first had her coffee, then reviewed patient files. There were 47 patients in the emergency department that day. Some elderly people who had heart attacks, some young people in traffic accidents, others were post-operative patients under observation. When she took a break at 2 p.m., Sandra looked out the window and noticed the dark clouds in the sky. Weather reports warned of heavy rain, but since such rains were common in San Francisco, no one paid much attention. When heavy rain started at 2:47 p.m., Sandra looked out the window and saw the river rising. In the first 10 minutes, the water level seemed normal, but Sandra's military training told her something different. This rain was not normal rain. When Sandra's military training kicked in, no one could predict what she would face. At 3:15 p.m., the power went out in the hospital. Generators kicked in, but communication systems completely collapsed. Sandra learned from the last news she heard on the television in the nurse center that the Hudson River in the north of the city had overflowed and the flood wave was moving toward the city center. At that time, most of the other personnel in the hospital had gone home to prepare for the night shift. Only Sandra, 2 student nurses, and a few security guards remained in the hospital. But the biggest problem was that there were 47 critical patients in the hospital. And at that moment, Sandra's real test began. There were 47 patients in the hospital. Most were elderly, some in intensive care, others post-operative. Among them were 78-year-old Mr. Martinez, who had a heart transplant, 23-year-old Anna experiencing post-birth complications, and 19-year-old Tommy, who had skull surgery after a motorcycle accident. And now, Sandra was left alone in a hospital with no electricity, non-functioning radios, cut off from the outside world, and floodwater had started to flood the basement. This is where everything changed. Sandra's true identity was about to be revealed. At 3:45 p.m., water had completely flooded the hospital's basement. Although Sandra hadn't yet reached the first floor where the patients were, she understood the seriousness of the situation. The student nurses were panicking, and the security guards wanted to flee, thinking about their own families. Looking at the panicked patients, Major Rodriguez's words from Afghanistan echoed in Sandra's mind. Jones, a health sergeant, doesn't just think about her own life. She fights for every life under her responsibility. You're not just a nurse here, you're a soldier, and soldiers don't leave their comrades behind. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. The situation was much worse than Sandra had anticipated. As Sandra went through the hospital's emergency protocols in her mind, she realized that floodwater was rising rapidly. The first floor was now underwater, electrical panels were soaked, and worst of all, the water level was rising toward the intensive care unit. Most patients in the hospital were connected to devices that needed constant electricity to survive. When Sandra realized the seriousness of the situation, she remembered her crisis training in Afghanistan. First, assess the situation, then calculate resources, and finally take action. This three-step strategy had kept Sandra alive and could now save the lives of 47 patients. But Sandra hadn't yet faced the biggest obstacle. Wait a minute, don't miss this detail. The decision Sandra made would shock everyone. At 4:30 p.m., as floodwater rose toward the second floor, Sandra knew she had two options: either climb to the upper floors of the building to save her own life, or stay to move 47 patients to safety. This was the hardest decision of Sandra's life. She blamed herself for not being able to save Mike in Afghanistan. Would this time be different? Civilian Sandra might have fled, but Sandra Jones, with her military background, heard Major Rodriguez's voice at that moment. Running is easy, Jones, but a soldier's duty is to do the hard thing. What you're seeing now is nothing. The real miracle was about to begin. Sandra gathered the hospital's emergency supplies. The crisis management she learned in Afghanistan kicked in. First, she organized the patients who could move and began moving them to the third floor. "Thompson," she shouted to the student nurse, "you take Mr. Wilson in that wheelchair. Garcia, check the oxygen tanks of the intensive care patients. Water's coming, we're moving everyone to the third floor." This commanding style came from Sandra's military background. In a crisis, someone had to lead, and others had to follow that leader. The student nurses were surprised by Sandra's sudden change, but decided to trust her. You won't believe this. Thanks to Sandra's military training, the impossible was becoming possible. At 5 p.m., the operation began in earnest. Sandra divided the 47 patients into three groups. First group, patients who could move. Second group, patients needing wheelchairs. Third group, critical patients connected to life support devices. One by one, she began moving 47 patients to safety. She carried Mr. Martinez on her back, supported Anna on the stairs, moved Tommy to the third floor on a stretcher. She developed a separate strategy for each patient, just as she had done for each wounded soldier in Afghanistan. But the hardest part hadn't come yet. The three patients in intensive care, the elderly woman with a heart transplant, the young mother with post-birth complications, and the young man with head trauma, were connected to life support units and couldn't be moved. Sandra had managed to get the electrical generator running on the third floor, but the water level was rising rapidly. At this point, Sandra would use the life-saving techniques she learned in Afghanistan. Sandra began providing manual life support for each patient in intensive care. Heart massage, artificial respiration, pulse control. She had to do all of this simultaneously. Her hands were covered in blood, she was out of breath, but she didn't stop. "I won't leave you," she murmured to the patients, just as she had said to Mike in Afghanistan. But this time was different. This time, Sandra would save them. You haven't seen the most dramatic moment yet. Sandra's final rescue operation. At 6:15 p.m., Sandra's biggest fear came true. The water level had risen to the door of the third floor, and only the roof remained in the hospital. But Sandra couldn't move all 47 patients to the roof, especially for the three patients on life support. This was impossible. As Sandra resuscitated the last patient in intensive care with a manual breathing device, floodwater had completely covered the second floor. She was reliving that traumatic moment she experienced in Afghanistan. That last light in Mike's eyes was still vivid in Sandra's memory. But this time, she wouldn't run away. And at that moment, Sandra's true heroism emerged. Sandra decided to try the last resort. She gathered all the batteries in the hospital and tried to make the life support devices portable. With the field medical techniques she learned in Afghanistan, she stabilized each patient. At that time, helicopter sounds began coming from outside. Rescue teams were finally trying to reach the hospital, but the floodwater made it difficult for the helicopter to land. But the most touching part of the story hadn't come yet. At 7:45 p.m., just minutes before the floodwater reached the third floor, rescue teams finally reached the hospital. When the paramedics who came by helicopter found Sandra on the third floor with 47 patients, they couldn't hide their amazement. When the rescue team leader approached Sandra, he noticed that her uniform was covered in blood, her hands weren't shaking, and that determined look in her eyes. "How did you manage this?" he asked, and Sandra just smiled and said, "I was once trained for these kinds of situations. Today, that training paid off. The rescue operation lasted 3 hours. Each patient was transported separately by helicopter to other hospitals in the city." Sandra refused to leave the hospital until she had safely delivered the last patient. And that night Sandra realized she had kept her promise to Mike. As she left the hospital, Sandra took out the small metal Mike carried on a chain and looked at it. "Do you see, Mike? This time I succeeded. This time I didn't lose anyone." Sandra, who blamed herself for not being able to save Mike in Afghanistan, had reconciled with her past by saving 47 patients that night. She now knew that her PTD didn't make her weak. On the contrary, it made her stronger. But the real beautiful ending of the story hadn't come yet. 3 days later, when Sandra returned to her normal duty at the hospital, a surprise was waiting for her in the corridors. The families of the 47 patients she saved, doctors, nurses, and hospital management were applauding her. They had banners. "Thank you, Sandra, our hero, 47 lives saved." And at that moment, Sandra realized she had reconciled with her past. The hospital director approached Sandra and said, "Thanks to you, 47 families were reunited with their loved ones today. This hospital is proud to have a hero like you." An elderly woman emerged from the crowd. She was the wife of Mr. Martinez, the heart transplant patient Sandra had saved that night. The woman hugged Sandra and said, "You are our angel. My husband owes his life to you." At that moment, Sandra felt that the pain of the losses in Afghanistan was diminishing, because she now knew that her military training could be used not only for war, but also to save lives in flood disasters. This is Sandra Jones's story. Real heroes never retire. The hospital management gave Sandra the Nurse of the Year award. But for Sandra, the real reward was the gratitude in the eyes of the families of the 47 patients. From that day on, Sandra stopped going to PTSD therapy because she had now reconciled with her past. Mike's death wasn't her fault, it was war's fault, and the 47 lives she saved that night were a worthy tribute to Mike's memory. Sandra still works at the same hospital today. A year later, Sandra was promoted to emergency coordinator at the hospital. Part of her job was also to counsel other veteran medical personnel on dealing with PTSD. On Sandra's desk sits a photo taken that night. The 47 patients, their families, and Sandra are all smiling together. Mike's medal hangs below the photo, and in every shift, with the hands that saved 47 lives in floodwater that night, she continues to touch new lives. If you were in Sandra's place, what would you do? Would you risk your own life for 47 human lives? Write to us in the comments and subscribe to our channel to continue hearing the heroic stories of our veterans. Turn on notifications so you don't miss stories of heroes like Sandra. Because real heroes don't just live on battlefields, but in hospital corridors, fire stations, and police departments. And their stories inspire us all.